You had some experience of that, didn't you, in the sort of, was it the 70s or the 80s, when you were working in it was a highly unionised environment, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, the union, I'm sure anyone who's lived through that period was pretty strong in these days. And I remember being in my early career, I was with Weir Pumps at the time, and my role in life was to try and create a CV that would be matched by no one. So I was in charge of a department when I was 21. I then took charge of a department of 200 welders and platers when I was 22, which was a pretty different environment. And in a highly unionised environment, I worked at how could we get this underperforming department to be a better performing. And we moved that department from underperforming to be the best performing. And I thought that was a pretty clever thing to do, although my peer group tended to be a decade or 2 decades older than me. So it wasn't necessarily young Buck Williamson was thought he was clever, but that wasn't necessarily the best emotionally intelligent tactic I used. And as a result of my success, we had gone through a period of reducing the workforce. So we reduced the workforce by about, I think it was 27 at the time, over a factory that had about 1,000 people in it. And they decided, rather than leave them in the environment, the union had negotiated they would work for 8 weeks, we would put them in a collective group, and that collective group would do chores around the factory. And lo and behold, they said, as a reward for how well you're doing in managing people, Brian, will give you that squad. So I got the 27 people who were effectively on death row. And I remember thinking, this is quite simple. I'll just do a spreadsheet. We didn't have Excel in these days, so it was pencil and rubber. I'll get Willie to do that, Frank to do that. And thought it was just a case of allocating duties, motivating them. But when someone says, I'm not doing that, are you going to fire me twice? You're then in a situation of I can't really manage them. And I remember being called, in these days we didn't have mobile phones, I was called by my bleeper going off, and it's the gatehouse. I phone the gatehouse and they say, you better come down here, Brian, we've got a bit of carnage going on. And part of my squad were painting the railings of the car park, and in a rather over exuberant manner had created some overspray and splashes onto some people's brand new cars. So that was like, wow. So I had to get Harry from the paint shop to divert his men off productive work, go and deal with that. I came into the factory and there's a man who had literally painted himself in the test bed into a corner, being lifted out by a crane, and all my peer group looking at me saying, well, he's not so smart now, is he? Because I felt I was the laughing stock of the factory. And I remember going home, and I went up to see my dad at that time, he was a bit of my mentor in life, saying, I think I've lost it here. I've created this great thing about how do I manage people, and suddenly within 24 hours, I'm actually looked upon as the buffoon that's got these 27 people in death row. My dad gave me some great advice. He said, just think of the size of the prize, son. He said, if you can motivate a man on death row, just think what you can do for someone who wants to fly. This is a test in your life. This is the real test. And if you master this, it will set you on a pathway for life. And I thought, that's all very well you saying that, but how do I do it? And his advice was, get to know every one of them as human beings. Put that spreadsheet in your drawer for 2 or 3 days. Understand their wants, their desires, their personal lives. They've all got them. They'll be pretty skillful. Some of them will be great sportsmen. Some of them will be good musicians. They'll have interest in their life. So I embarked upon doing that for the rest of the week. And what came out of that in the end was I got to know one particular chap, Frank, really well because he was a fisherman, and he taught me all I needed to know about fish. And because I understood him, I went fishing, I told him how I got on, went with my Uncle Jimmy and we caught some trout, and he said, oh, you should have used a woolly bugger as a fly, they're better in cloudy atmospheres. So we created a bit of a bond. And before I knew it, Frank was saying, look, you've got Davey moving these castings, he's a wee bit older, let's get him to move the racks. In fact, leave it with me and I'll sort it. So before I knew it, Frank was my charge hand. He was working my group. And I remember the day he left, he shook my hands and said, I wish I had met you earlier, I may not have been in this position. And it was a really emotional time for me. And I said, well, I wish I'd met you earlier, because I would have learned a whole lot more about managing people. So for me, that was the biggest lesson I could ever have learned, was everybody is an extraordinary person inside them, even someone who's on death row. Your job is just to find out what it is.
That's actually a brilliant story. I think to summarise a little bit, you've got to establish rapport, genuine rapport with people first before you can ask them to do anything. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, and that genuine rapport is being in the moment and really listening to the person and being genuinely interested. It's rather like being immersed in a movie. If you're doing your emails and watching a movie, you're not actually watching the movie, but if you immerse yourself in the movie, you get engaged with it. So speaking to someone is just immerse yourself in that movie and try and sit in that person's shoes and understand the difficulties they've got. And from that, you will create a rapport which hopefully would build on trust. And from trust, anything is possible.